Thank you for joining us. This webinar will begin in just a few minutes. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on Rethinking Natural Disasters After COVID-19, Building Local Resilience to Earthquakes, Mudslides, and Wildfires. Next slide. My name is Erica Manuel. I am the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator today. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be sharing that recording, the slide deck, and any related resources with all the registrants following this webinar. All of your lines have been muted for the duration of the webinar, but you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties during this session or any questions of our panelists during their presentations, please feel free to use that function. Next slide. Our community's risk from natural disasters continues to increase despite COVID. When homes, businesses, and infrastructure are destroyed, our very society is at risk of wide-scale shutdown. Many of us in California are also experiencing a significant heat wave for the next 5 to 7 days. In addition to significant wildfire risk, we're seeing rolling blackouts and major stress on our energy systems. This webinar is designed to help local government elected officials and staff understand the current risks around natural disasters and explore options for leveraging science, data, and effective planning to protect and prepare communities. Specifically, we're going to discuss resiliency. We're going to talk about how local leaders can assess, mitigate, and prepare for the disruption from a major disaster, like a wildfire, an earthquake, or a mudslide. This is an incredibly robust topic, so we're also going to focus our discussion around disasters' impacts to energy infrastructure. We know that COVID response and recovery has just been a huge priority for local agencies this year. But as we move deeper into our traditional fire season and as our fault lines continue to be increasingly active, it's important to remember that there are concurrent threats to our communities. We have to remain vigilant about COVID response, but we also have to do everything possible to prepare for a natural disaster that could strike at any time. Our goal is to keep that conversation top of mind. Next slide. This is the agenda for today's discussion. I want to start by giving you an overview of the technology and logistics and then dive into the content. We're going to start with a short overview of ILG for those of you that are not familiar with our organization. And then we're going to move right into our keynote presentation from world-renowned disaster expert, Dr. Lucy Jones. Then we'll have shorter panel presentations from our subject matter experts around energy infrastructure before we jump into the Q&A. Our keynote speaker and 3 panelists should be visible on your screens, and I'll introduce them more formally in just a few minutes. But we have, offering a local agency perspective, so grateful to have Reva Feldman, the city manager of Malibu, on the line with us. For a utility perspective, we are happy to have Joseph Avila, the Senior Director of Energy Policy and Strategy at SoCalGas. And for a statewide perspective and insights, we have Tom Ducker, the team lead for the Critical Infrastructure Protection Unit and State Threat Assessment Center with Cal OES, in addition to Dr. Lucy Jones. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about how this webinar will work. Even though we've all been sheltering in place now, I think, 5 months, we spend a lot of time on Zoom. We spend a lot of time on Microsoft Teams and in webinars, but every technology solution is a little bit different, and it's always nice to clarify some technical details so you know what to expect. For today, as I mentioned, all the participants will be on mute during the entire presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type your questions into the question box at any time during the webinar, and you can see on the screen how to do that. The question box is not the chat box. The ILG team will be reviewing the question box, so the chat box is what's going to be visible to everyone. We will be working throughout the webinar to review questions and determine the best time to ask them during the session. Any questions about logistics or presentations can be answered there. We will also be playing a video during this presentation. When that video gets loaded up, in order to hear the video, you will need to have your computer audio turned on, even if you are listening by phone. Next slide. So at this point in the webinar, we'd like to know who's on the line. We cannot see your faces, but we definitely want to know who's here with us. So please just tell us a little bit about yourself. We have 2 full questions that will help our panelists better plan for your questions. My ILG colleague is on the line behind the scenes, Randy Kay, and she is going to administer this poll. Randy Kay, please proceed. Which best describes your agency or organization? Are you with a county, a city, a special district, a state agency, a private, corporate, nonprofit, or other organization? And we'll just let those results come in. Great, looks like we've got 38% city, 8% county, 6% special district, 4% state agency, and 44% of other. Great, thank you so much. Randy Kay, do we have one more question? What best describes your relationship to local government? Are you staff? Are you elected officials? Are you consultants or others? And again, this just helps us tailor some of our comments and maybe even the questions, the way that we answer those questions as well. Excellent. 40% are staff, 46% are other, and then we've got elected officials and consultants, a nice mix of everyone on the line. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We're very happy to have everybody on the line, regardless of your affiliation, but it's always nice to know who's joined us today. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the presenter introductions, I do want to tell you a little bit about ILG. As I mentioned during the intro, I'm the CEO of ILG. My name is Erica Manuel, and I've been at the helm for about 18 months. And just like you, we've been navigating COVID, and we're in the midst of, as you know, what is really an invasive and destructive crisis to hit local government more than ever and possibly in a century. The good news for you is that ILG is nonpartisan, we're nonprofit, and we are here to help. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of 3 statewide associations representing local governments, the League of California Cities, CSAC, and the California Special Districts Association. Together with those 3 affiliates, we serve over 2,500 local agencies at cities, counties, and special districts. And our goal is to provide practical, easy-to-use resources so local agency leaders can effectively implement policies on the ground. We understand local government, we love local government, and that's why what we do centers around helping local leaders navigate complexity. One of the reasons we're excited about this webinar today is that there are a few things more complex than preparing a community for a natural disaster in the midst of a pandemic. Next slide. ILG has 4 main program areas or pillars of work. We do leadership and governance, civics education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. Our mission is, again, to help local leaders navigate complexity. We do that by offering a range of services across our pillars, education and training like this webinar, deep technical assistance and capacity building to help really stretch your ability to deliver on programs and services. And we also convene key stakeholders. We provide facilitation services around sticky and sometimes challenging topics when it's helpful to have a neutral party in the room that really understands how local government works and can also speak the language of the community. Next slide. As many of you know, climate change is an escalating threat that is having a dramatic impact on the economies, health, and the way of life of California communities. The work we do at ILG and our Sustainable and Resilient Communities program is designed to help local leaders with the resources and relationships they need to address difficult decisions around land use, infrastructure, public services, and community resilience. Also have tools, programs, and resources to help local governments integrate equity and resilience into mitigation and climate programs. Please visit our website to learn more. Next slide. When the COVID pandemic hit, we pivoted like you did, and we wanted to make sure local leaders had the resources they needed to navigate the crisis. Please check out our website at the COVID link down, you'll note on that page, where you can see all of our previous webinars and resources. Next slide. Our next webinars are in just a few weeks. Our Sustainable and Resilient Communities pillar is working with HCD, the Housing and Community Development, on a technical assistance workshop for local agencies trying to meet their RENA goals, with a specific webinar on public engagement for housing elements. And we partnered with many public law groups to bring you a session about fiscal preparedness and labor relations during COVID. Both of those webinars are the first week of September. We hope that you'll join us. Now, let's get to our featured presentation. Next slide. This topic that we're talking about today, natural disasters and preparedness and energies for infrastructure, it's incredibly timely, and our speakers are highly sought after, but sessions like this take considerable time and resources to pull together, even in a virtual environment, and even for a nonprofit. So we are incredibly grateful to our webinar sponsor, SoCalGas, for underwriting this webinar and allowing us to offer it to you free of charge. Thank you, SoCalGas. So as I mentioned, next slide, we are joined today by 4 speakers with in-depth information about natural disasters, disaster preparedness, and energy infrastructure. Our first speaker is a phenomenal and world-renowned expert in natural disasters, Dr. Lucy Jones. She is the founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society. That center's mission is to foster the understanding and application of scientific information in the creation of a more resilient communities. She has been a research associate at the Seismological Laboratory of Caltech since 1984 and recently published a book entitled The Big Ones. Dr. Jones works closely with both the public and private sectors to help increase communities' ability to adapt and be resilient so that a dynamic changes around them. Her passion is understanding and communicating where the greatest vulnerabilities lie and what actions we can take to reduce risks that are also cost-effective. Dr. Jones has a PhD in geophysics from MIT and has been active in earthquake research for decades. As I mentioned, we'll hear from Dr. Jones first. We'll try and take a couple questions before opening it up to the other panelists. As a reminder, attendees, you may ask questions via the questions box throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as possible during one of the Q&A portions of this webinar. Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm hoping to be able to share my screen, but that should be coming up very soon.
Yes.
I wanted to, here we are. I've been, let's see. There we are. So I want to talk with you today about disasters in the time of a pandemic. And, you know, they talked to me about potentially helping, how do you manage all of these things? And I really cannot in 30 minutes tell you how to manage earthquakes, mudslides, and wildfires within the time of a pandemic. That's not a 30-minute topic. What I want to do instead is really try to talk to you about how we think about disasters and suggest that looking at the disaster of COVID also would help us understand how we can manage a lot of other disasters. Because I will absolutely say that that the pandemic is indeed a disaster. When you look at what the International Red Cross defines a disaster as being, a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of the community to exceed the capacity that we have to respond to it, I think it's pretty clear that the pandemic falls within that category. What's really different is the time frame over which it's happening. And when you think about it, earthquakes happen in terms of a minute or so. Some of our other disasters, like floods and wildfires, will go on for days and weeks. The pandemic is really, at least a year and maybe a couple of years because we're really struggling to get it in control. And then I added climate change to the picture. It is also a disaster happening on a much longer time frame where we are going to be struggling it's a century before the outcomes are really going to be clear. But I think we need to remember that it's going to be part of it. And I think that this is a bit of a challenge for us because when we tend to think of disasters, we think of the sudden calamitous event that we go from our, perfectly fine mall to, complete destruction in extremely suddenly. And we tend to think of it in that way. And then the whole thing of when is it happening becomes incredibly important. Is it going to be today? Is it going to be next week? When is it going to happen? We put a lot of energy into thinking about it that way. And what I'm hoping to do through this talk is help you try and move off of that focused on when type of time approach to disasters and think of them as a geoscientist does, that they're just an inevitable part of our natural processes. When you have a river like this, which is very necessary to a lot of communities and be able to have our source of water and whatever, at some point that river is also going to look like this. This is just the disaster, the flood that comes is an inevitable part of having the river in your community in the first place. It's being driven by heat. This may be a throwback to some of your high school classes or something, but the basic idea that there is a cycle that goes on that drives the water around the area and helps us go on to, it allows us to have the rain, but it's a physical system that can be studied and understood. This is what science is about. And it helps us understand not exactly when a particular flood is going to happen, but where and why and what the consequences are. And the funny, it's a little more obvious with rain that it's being driven by heat and how the water evaporates and moves over the land. In fact, when you go to our geologic hazards, it's also about heat, just on a much longer time frame. Now we're talking about the heat within the earth and the fact that it's hot at depth and that needs to get exchanged with the cold rock on the surface. Instead of having storms that move through for days or weeks, we now have millions of years to move the convection cells around. But it is actually still the same fundamental process that leads to our various geologic hazards. So that when we have volcanoes, they may not erupt for thousands of years in between, but we know that we have the volcano there. The other thing maybe isn't completely obvious to a non-geologist. It's also why we want to be near the volcanoes. Volcanoes actually produce really wonderful soils that make it be very productive. So we tend to build our cities and our communities near the volcanoes because we can get much better farming going on that way. And we build our cities near faults. Here's San Francisco Bay is there because the San Andreas system is going through and offsetting the rocks, creating natural features that make them good places for us to be able to build our cities. And if you're going to be building near a fault or a volcano, there will be times when that natural process leads to these disruptions that we have, which create for us a significant disaster. So what I'm trying to say here is let's think about disasters as extreme points in natural systems. And working together with scientists, you can figure out what are the natural disasters that are going to be relevant to your community. Every one of us has some sort of natural disaster, whether it's earthquakes and extreme heat events in California. You could move away from your earthquakes and get the snow in South Dakota or the hurricanes in Florida. every one of us has something like this, and we need to consider it just part of our regular system, and something that we have to plan for, even though we don't know when they are going to be happening. So disasters are part of natural systems, but they also then come and interact with human systems. So what do I mean by human systems? Let's think about what a city is like. It begins by putting in pipes. We have water pipes and sewer pipes and gas pipes, and all of those underlay the other parts of the city that we think of, where we have our homes, we have our buildings that we work in, we have our manufacturing areas, we have electrical systems, we have transportation systems, we have communication systems. Whenever you have a city, any community, you have a system of systems that needs to work together for us to be able to have the modern life that we expect to have in a human environment. All right? So when you think about this system, you know, some of it's built really well. Maybe some of it is now really old and becoming weak. And what we see when those disasters come through and disrupt our system, that they fail where they are already weak. So it's the levee that hasn't been inspected that's going to fail in the flood, or the water pipe that's been there for too long and developed weaknesses that breaks in the earthquake, or the inadequate bridge that wasn't designed for the right level of shaking in the first place. And I think that's where you've got to think about this. We know that we will eventually have it. How do we do that longer term planning? I know that that is a challenge to every human endeavor, is how to think beyond the short term to the long term. But when you know you have the disasters and you don't know when they're going to be happening, we need to think about those longer pictures and what it's going to be doing to us. So when we think about this system, we have our natural systems that give us our disasters, our human systems that are disrupted by it, and the failures in these systems where they're already weak. To look at this in a bit more detail, I want to move off the more scientific side here and go to a couple of stories of previous disasters to see how this plays out and what the implications can be of thinking in these different ways. So I'm going to do this in Japan, a country that's had more disasters than we do. They have about 3 times as many earthquakes as we have on the long run, and they get hurricanes. They call them, right, the typhoons that they have. And so they are a country that has eventually learned how to design and live with disasters. They didn't always have it that way. You know, the city of Tokyo was a very small community until what's called the Meiji Restoration, when the emperor moved from Kyoto and moved up into this region. And Tokyo developed very, very quickly. It went from a very small town to about 4 million people in a matter of about 30 years at the beginning of the 20th century. Everything was thrown together and built on top of each other this way. They then suffered an earthquake in 1923. 60% of the buildings in Tokyo, 80% of the buildings in Yokohama were destroyed by this earthquake. If you look in the lower right corner here, you can see that I have a map, and you can see the little square that's over it. That's the area of the fault. And so when an earthquake happens, it happens over a surface, not at a point. And every point on that surface gives off energy. So you can see what happened here. Those colors show you how strong the shaking was. The most densely inhabited part of Japan was literally on top of this earthquake. 60% of the buildings destroyed in Tokyo, and fires that went through. You know, we've been hearing in the news this week about the fire tornado. In fact, those formed in Tokyo after this earthquake. It happened at noon when everybody was making their lunches. All their braziers fell over, set off fires. fire swept through the city, and they had these fire tornadoes forming. In Japanese, the translation comes out actually as dragon twist, that roared through and killed 140,000 people. The people who went through this described it as saying, if this were not hell, where would hell be? And so here's what happens when you haven't planned for the earthquake beforehand. You can face this incredible level of destruction, and you can face really significant social disruption because of it. In response to this earthquake, great trauma, the government struggling to respond, a lot of people starting to blame the government. They responded by turning on the other. And in one of the most horrible things connected with the natural disaster, actually 6,000 Koreans who were living in the Tokyo and Yokohama area were slaughtered by their neighbors in the 4 days after the earthquake. And it was almost a ritual, kill the other, to expiate the sins of our society. They needed to blame someone. And there were rumors going through that the Koreans had somehow caused the earthquake or were poisoning wells or setting the fires. But it really is a reflection of one of the features of earthquake, of all disasters and human response to it, that our most constant response is to find somebody to blame. You know, when we are evolved to respond to danger by looking for patterns, by using our brain to make ourselves safer. So we need to find a pattern that helps us be safe. And a pattern that says it's the victim's fault is a pattern that lets us feel safer, because we can say, I'm not going to make the same mistake that those victims made. And it's a way to feel safer in this situation. So we often turn to blame. This is probably one of the most extreme examples of it, but it's something to be aware of. It's happening to a certain amount right now in our response to COVID. The desire to blame somebody for what's going on here is really strong. And I'm not going to say there isn't plenty of blame to go around. I'm going to suggest, though, that that's perhaps not the most useful approach to how to move forward. And yet, if we can recognize that it's a human desire to do this, it'll make it easier for us to manage this. It doesn't have to go this way, though. If to go to another extreme, I want to look at another Japanese earthquake, and that's the most recent one, the magnitude 9 that happened in 2011 off of the east coast of the island of Honshu, as you see in this picture. So you can see essentially half of the main island of Japan experienced extremely strong shaking in this earthquake. This is bigger potentially than what we would be seeing from the Cascadia earthquake up in the Pacific Northwest. The earthquake itself is a lot stronger than the San Andreas would be able to give us. Luckily, by being offshore, it doesn't give quite as much shaking on land, but it was extreme shaking. And this is the city of Sendai, which was directly on top of this area, right in the middle of this area of Japan. And this is the picture after the earthquake. Through the decades of the 20th century, Japan learned to say, rather than thinking about when the earthquake's going to be happening, how do we get ready to be able to respond to this one? And this is the ultimate proof that mitigation works. You do not have to fall down in an earthquake. You can build to resist it if you really understand what it's going to do. And a lot of this is I'm turning to scientists and engineers to help them understand what's going to be the extreme shaking they get and how to respond to it. Unfortunately, of course, science isn't perfect, and they did underestimate the amount of slip across the fault. Unfortunately, that's what controls the tsunami, and they had seawalls to protect themselves from the incoming tsunamis, but this tsunami was more than twice as large as has ever been seen before, and it was insufficient to be able to prevent the damage that came through the area. And of course, to compound problems, that tsunami not only hit the villages along the coast, it also hit the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. It led to radiation releases from the plant as it melted down, radiation that blew over inhabited areas and created quite a level of contamination. People were forced to evacuate from all of this area near the plant. And, you know, this is another really important lesson, that it's cascading failures can magnify the disaster. The earthquake alone, they were fine. Insufficient to the tsunami, it hurt. When the power plant was not prepared for the tsunami, that's when they ended up in a situation where they were low on power for years. I know that they were, imagine if we were sitting in this current heat wave and had to do what Tokyo did, which was set our air conditioning at 85 degrees. And that was because they had insufficient power to keep it running. So it's some of the really big problems can happen through these cascading disasters. And as you think to plan ahead, I can't tell you what are all the things that might intersect, but always make sure that you are thinking about the ways in which these might intersect with each other, because we need to plan together and look for our interdependencies. This is a place where silos do us the greatest harm. So as people moved out from here, a lot of them moved into this refugee housing in Fukushima City. It was incredibly disrupting to the whole region. Life as they knew it disappeared. We keep on saying that this year. Let me tell you, what happened in Japan was way beyond anything that we're experiencing right now in terms of disruption to life. But it also became an opportunity for incredibly positive change. When I went up and visited there, I got to meet this woman. Her name is Maki Sahara. She was a housewife in the region, taking care of her little children when the earthquake hit. Responding to the disruption to their community from all of this radiation, she ended up getting out there and becoming much more involved in her community. If you see the green sheets behind you, they are covering a deposit of all of the topsoil for the whole city of Fukushima. It's about 300,000 people who live there. They had to take up the top couple inches of any exposed ground across the whole city because of the radiation contamination that was there. It was deposited in this region. And one of the things she did is she fought and got those radiation monitors that you see right up against the green sheet that was able to tell the community when radiation levels were getting too high. And, she also fought and got these radiation monitors in the city parks so that the children could know when it was safe to play in a park and when radiation was too high and they need to stay out of the grass. And she showed me that what really matters is what happens to our communities. So when you think about the disaster, don't just think of it as what, is happening physically. It's what's happening to our people. And of course, we're seeing that in spades right now with the COVID-19 disaster. And it also becomes opportunities. This area of Japan was one of the most traditional parts where women had really very limited opportunity for any sort of activities outside of the home. They have been so disrupted by the earthquake and the tsunami and the radiation that has changed. People like Maki have been able to move forward and take on new activities. This is her now. She actually just got elected to the city council, and she is now part of local government, as you are, going from imagining she couldn't possibly be doing anything like this to now really giving in and helping change her community. And I think that that's the most important lesson that we have to have here, is that people really make a difference. And individual action to say, my community matters, my government matters, I'm going to get involved, is what gets us through the disaster. Because it's really about all of us together and how we can help each other. So now, if we keep on, what am I trying to say in all of this, in our new paradigm for how to think about disasters? Start with disasters happen. They will happen at some point. They're part of the system. It's part of natural life. It's not like you'd say maybe the San Andreas earthquake will never happen. Maybe it won't happen in the time that you're alive, but it will happen in the lifetime of your community. And it's just going to be part of what's there. So then we need to look at, given that it's going to happen, where is it going to hurt us? And that the damage will happen where our society is already weak. Now that can mean in physical terms that it's the power plant that had its backup generator at too low a level, or the levee that hasn't been inspected. It also means within our human system. And as we've seen this year, when we stressed our society, the inherent weakness of American society, of our history of racism and how that's played out, that's what came to the foreground this summer. Because when we stress a human system, just like with the physical system, we are going to see the problems where we already are weak and not functioning as well as we could. So the next thing I say, focus on what and not when. When is the part we don't know. But usually we know exactly what will happen. We can tell you what will be in this earthquake. Go look for the shakeout scenario if you want to see what's going to happen in a Southern California earthquake, or the haywired scenario for a Northern California earthquake. We know what will happen. We won't know when. I thought I'd take a little bit of a detour just here. This last week, we all saw the earthquake advisory that was issued just a week ago. There were earthquakes happening down in the Salton Sea. That red line is the San Andreas Fault. So these earthquakes were happening just beyond the southern end of the fault. That's one of the locations we think is a likely place to start a big earthquake. So when it happened, we have a way of analyzing what the risks will be. The U.S. Geological Survey said the chance of a San Andreas earthquake in the next week is very low, but it's 1%, and that is 1 in 100. And given that most weeks it's about a 1 in 10,000, this was a significant increase in the risk, even though the absolute risk was low. Okay? So a lot of people then focus, oh heavens, are we going to have the San Andreas earthquake this week? Well, it's now been a week. We're not. And also, when you see something like this is going to happen anytime there's a significant earthquake very near the San Andreas. If it's in Los Angeles, we won't be saying this. When it was in Ridgecrest, we didn't say this. It needs to be right next to the fault that you're worried about setting off. And this sort of advisory will be issued every time we have an earthquake like this. And when you think about how you're going to respond, think about what this makes you think of, and then ask yourself, should I be doing this anyway? Now, there are some short-term things you could do, like asking your emergency managers not to go on vacation this week. But in terms of the things that are really going to make a difference in preparing for the earthquake, you don't want to just be doing them a couple hours before it happens. You want it in the first place. So now we go back to focus on what, not when. Let me also finish by saying you can use science to understand what will happen and work together to prevent it. When I'm a scientist, I'm going to think that this is a really important thing to do. Science is a process for understanding what is true and then being able to make predictions of what's going to be the likely consequence of decisions. So when you want to do evidence-based decision making, it is the scientific process that helps you understand what the evidence is telling you that you want to do. And if we look at what's going on here in the United States at this moment, what's going on with COVID cases, we are seeing what happens when you don't listen to the science. The epidemiologists were extremely clear to us that we needed to wait until the number of cases had gone down for 2 weeks in a row before we opened up. We didn't do it. We are living the consequences. And unfortunately, one of those consequences are a lot of people are dying in the United States because we didn't use the information that we had. When you compare this with Japan, This is at the same rate. This is the number of cases per million residents. Japan has learned through the years of dealing with earthquakes that they need to listen to the science and make their decisions accordingly. And people are not dying there because they were able to look forward just as they do with the earthquakes. So I'm going to end by saying, I want you to use science. You need to, that's, where we're continuing to go. Where can you get the science? There are government agencies who specifically are creating this information. If I were in charge of them, I would probably be requiring some more work to get that information connected to those of you who can use it. That can be a bit of a challenge with these government agencies, but the information is there, and there are people who want to work with you when you reach out to them, because all of these are understood the consequences are predictable, even when the time is not. And I really hope that we can all use this, because we really are all in this together, and it is only by working together that we can make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We have gotten a couple questions from our panelists, and we know that there's a lot that I know you weren't able to talk about today, but there's two things we want to touch base on before we move to the next panelist comments. One question that we've gotten is related to the weather that we're having, and this is maybe what some might call a stupid question, but it's a real one that we hear a lot. Is there such a thing as earthquake weather?
No, absolutely not. However, every culture in the world with earthquakes has a tradition of earthquake weather. But it's different in each country. It depends upon what was the weather that they had with their most memorable earthquake. So my generation talks about very hot weather as earthquake weather because we were having a very hot Santa Ana when the 1987 Whittier Narrows earthquake happened. And we all noticed this. It was October 1st. It's a common time for really hot weather in Los Angeles, right? My mother's generation called still foggy weather earthquake weather because that's what they had with the Long Beach earthquake in 1933, which is also pretty common to have on March 10th when that earthquake happened. So the tradition is there. Actually, in my podcast, I just did one on earthquake myths and why we believe them even though they're not true. So I can give you more there.
Excellent. Thank you for dispelling the myths. I think so many people feel that way. And you're right, it's passed down based on your most recent experience with an earthquake. And it's just, every generation has their own perception. One other question before we move to our other panelists is that we have gotten some people that are really resonating with the blame response conversation that you began. And they had an experience with a local wildfire where people were blaming others. And usually it was people that had lost property and they just needed someone to blame or something. And the question is for you, if you have any thoughts on how to take the emotional response out of that and to help affected people work together on the recovery and mediation efforts. And we'll ask that actually to our other panelists as well who've also gone through it.
Yeah, it's one of the more challenging ones. It's, as a scientist, it's much easier for me to analyze and say, okay, that's what the problem is, than to do the human part of figuring out what the solution is. But I think recognizing that, think about it when you hear somebody has cancer. Did they smoke? Or, boy, what was their job and all of those chemicals they were exposed to? We look for a reason because it makes us feel safer when we do this. So one of the things, is to let people vent. That is an important part of it. And so if they feel listened to, it's less likely to move on to a lawsuit or whatever that other sort of response is. But I am struggling to try and understand the better response to it in that social side of it. And I would think people are there because they're scared. And if you recognize that anger is just an easier emotion to face than fear, That's another piece of why we want to move on to blame, because then we feel like we're doing something. So it's really about helping people face their fear. And I think there's a complication, especially with the wildfires. People lose their property, they've lost so much. And in America, we also tend to do the same blame game for being poor. Because if the poor person deserves it, if it's because they're lazy or they won't work or whatever it is, then we can again think that can't happen to me. The wildfire moves through and suddenly you've lost everything you own. Wait a minute, you're now poor. And our society says that's your fault. So again, we want to turn it back on the other side. So I think there's an aspect of sympathy that's needed and a recognition that the real driving motivation is fear that gets expressed as anger.
Thanks for that. That's social science is important to know. All right, thank you so much for that. And we're going to hear more from you in a little bit. We're going to move on to our next panelist. And our next panelist is also no stranger to natural disasters, but has a really specific local government response experience. Riva Feldman has more than 20 years of experience in public service, including the city of Malibu, where she has served since 2005 and was appointed city manager in 2016. In 2018, Riva successfully led the city of Malibu during the Woolsey Fire, which was Los Angeles County's largest natural disaster. Riva is currently the president of the League of California City Managers Department, and she brings a unique perspective on this topic as local agency staff. Riva, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. So thank you again. I'm really honored to speak right after Dr. Jones, no pressure there, but happy to be able to share a little bit of the story that I've experienced here in Malibu. Next slide, please. So in Malibu, we are always ready for a disaster. Things happen here. We have had multiple fires. We've had mudslides. We have lots of rain. We have road closures. We have car accidents. It's just kind of a daily thing for us. And so it's something we talk about frequently. We're a small city. We have about 13,000 residents, but we have a visitor population of about 15 million people. So we are sort of a little city with big city problems. And so we take planning for disasters and preparation very, very seriously. And so if you had asked me in 2018, are you ready for a big disaster? I would have said, absolutely, we are ready. We've been practicing for this. And then the Woolsey Fire hit, and just a little lead up, we're going to show a short video in a minute. The week of the Woolsey Fire, we had multiple things go wrong. My sheriff captain had a stroke, and he was out, and his number two was someone who had just started that day who I had never met. We had an election, so we had a new governor, a new sheriff, and I had two new city council members. And on Wednesday evening, the Borderline Grill shooting happened in Thousand Oaks, and a Pepperdine student, which is Pepperdine is in Malibu, lost her life. We had 16 students who were at the grill during the shooting, and it was just, very close to home. And so we thought that was about as bad as it could get. And on Thursday of that week, we were the third fire to break out in one day after the Paradise Fire and the Hill Fire. And so we ended up being the last to get resources. So I'm going to play a little video and then go a little bit more into my story. You can start the video now, please.
Hey, I need, if I could get a ladder truck, on my way up to our truck.
So thank you for taking the time to watch that. Next slide, please. So as you can see, a lot goes wrong, and because this was supposed to focus on infrastructure, I'm just going to touch on a few of the things that went really wrong for us, which was we lost power throughout the Woolsey fire area. Southern California Edison lost close to 2,000 power poles. And one of the things we learned after the fire was during the evacuation process for our city, there was virtually no power. And so when you lose power, you not only lose electricity, but you're going to lose your cell phone communication, and you're going to lose Wi-Fi. And in this day and age, most people who have home phones at home are connected to their internet. And so it was a very important lesson that we learned of how to continue to communicate with our residents when you don't have these types of tools. Next slide, please. And so in the aftermath of the fire, what we did was make sure that we have set up as many redundant communication systems. Some of them we had in place. Some of them we were using. What we didn't know is that people weren't getting the information that we were pushing out. And so I bring this up because I think it's very important for small cities, in particular contract cities, to make sure that they have different ways not only of communicating with their residents, but of getting information from their law enforcement agencies. Because we were at City Hall, I was fortunate enough to have, we have backup generator system here, we have multiple ways of communicating, and we have copper landlines. If I hadn't had that in the very heat of the moment of the fire, I wouldn't have been able to get the information about the evacuations. Later in the afternoon on the day of the fire, we actually ended up evacuating our City Hall, which was a great test system for what we're going through now with COVID, because we had to learn how to run our city virtually and remotely like everybody is doing now. So I list a few of the things that we not only had and now things that we've come up with since the fire. One we used most recently during COVID, which was making sure that people who don't have communication capability at home have a way of getting current information, and we dummied it down to old school. We print out posters, and in COVID, we've been putting them up in the windows of the supermarket. We have the ability to put them on sandwich boards and put them around natural gathering places like churches or schools where people can come and get information. One of the things that happened to my community in Woolsey was that many residents stayed behind, and then they were in the evacuation zone without any information. And so we want to make sure that in a disaster, for us it was the fire that we learned our lessons from, but we're all at risk, as Dr. Jones explained, of an earthquake. And so what do you do and how do you communicate with your community when there isn't any power? And so that was one of the ways that we came up with that. You can also use things like changeable message signs and put those where people can see them and put information out on that. Of course, you can always use loudspeakers, and don't forget about communication through radio channels. We're fortunate enough to have a local radio station where we can push out information, but that's another option as well. Next slide, please. So the other thing, too, that's very important is making sure that you have real-time information and that you're sharing that real-time information with your residents during a disaster. I actually put this slide in this morning because we had a couple fires yesterday and in Malibu, and the one on the lower right, what we've done is we're working with a company that can do mapping of a fire, the path of a fire in real time. They take the point of origin of a fire, they input data, terrain, current weather, wind, historic fire burn areas. So if a fire has burned in a certain area, they'll be able to chart the vegetation and the density of the growth in that area, and then give real-time information of where that will probably go. So the image on the right is actually data from yesterday from a fire that we had that started in the Santa Monica Mountains adjacent to Malibu. Gave me a little bit of a scare because the neighborhood on the upper right of the screen there is actually my neighborhood, so it could have been heading towards me. We had an unusual wind situation yesterday where winds were blowing from the south to the north, which is unusual for our area. Luckily, they got that out in just 75 acres. But I just wanted to share some of the tools that we've taken upon ourselves as a small city to make sure that I'm getting as much information about what's going on right when it's happening, hopefully with power, so I can get this information so that I can think 3 steps ahead of where's this fire going, what do I need to do, who do I need to notify, what area would be next. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we went through, as I mentioned, we did not have power, and in Malibu, our main ingress and egress is through Pacific Coast Highway, and there's multiple signals that go through Pacific Coast Highway. And in the Woolsey fire, all of those signals went dark, and so the traffic of people evacuating, thousands and thousands of people evacuating at the same time, ended in gridlock. And so that's something we never want to have happen again. Fortunately, we did not have any disasters where that also, impacted people's lives, but it could, and we certainly saw that in Paradise. And so we've come up with a lot of different ways to communicate about evacuations and how to think about evacuations. The tool I showed in the last slide with the GIS mapping is one of them. But we've also been conducting drills of neighborhoods. We've come up with maps, evacuation maps that give all different types of routes to evacuate. We've come up with evacuation zones whereby we could do it systematically so everybody's not evacuating at the same time. We've come up with what we call safe refuge areas, which are large parking lots where people can just drive to and then wait there until it's safe. And then we've done different types of communication systems. One, the image you see on the right, is one of my staff members, and we purchased dozens and dozens of bullhorns, and we actually can deploy city staff and city vehicles to drive through neighborhoods to either share information or conduct evacuations. And so again, it's just trying to be as robust and redundant as possible. Well, we're also looking at installing siren warning systems, which are the old-fashioned air raid systems that work without having to have a Wi-Fi or internet. So again, the important thing is to have as many tools in your toolbox to share information, to get information, and to keep residents safe and informed at all times. Next slide, please. So as we move forward into fire season, or actually I think fire season is all year round now, but the technical official start of fire season, it's very important for cities to make sure that you have practiced using your EOC, talking about what that means. Obviously, we're all running sort of a virtual EOC during COVID, but now that we are looking forward to what could this look like to do a large-scale evacuation with COVID going on, you want to talk about what happens if you have multiple staff members who are sick. How are you going to handle that? What do your shelters look like? You need to make sure you've coordinated that with your Red Cross. And what is it going to look like to do things like rebuilding in the age of COVID, where back in the old days, a year ago, 2 years ago, we were able to have a disaster assistance center where you had hundreds of people in one building or one room trying to help your residents. That's not going to be a model that's going to be able to exist during COVID. So you want to make sure that you're thinking through some of those real-time things that can happen with our current restraints of COVID. Next slide, please. And then certainly you want to talk about what that means to be the person or the people running an EOC during COVID. Are you going to have to test staff members? How are you going to do that? Who's going to handle that? Are we safe? And I put up on the right side, the top slide is certainly what an EOC used to look like, and now under COVID, it may look more like a Zoom meeting where everybody's working from home remotely, and you want to make sure that we have the ability to have all the documents and information that you need for your EOC. Do you have enough cell phones? Are people Do they have the equipment that they need at home to be able to effectively run a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation, and work through those types of things now, come up with mock schedules and test everything, because that is going to be something we're going to have to face if we're not all able to be back in our EOC rooms, our EOC centers during COVID. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to give some very high level, some of the things that I've learned, and to make sure that you're thinking ahead. Again, to me, the key is communication and making sure that you have the ability to get good information and share that good information back out with your community or your visitor community in real time. Use everything you can. Too much information during a disaster is okay. And make sure that you have taken the time now to know all the different partners, whether it's with the county or the state or your local cities that are nearby, and make sure that your own staff members are aware of what they might have to do. And then my last tip that I always like to share is that if power is out and you need to get information, you can always get in your car and turn on the radio, and hopefully you can get information there. So that concludes my presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Reva. We're going to keep moving because we have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure we get to all of our panelists, but thank you so much for that. And I think what we're hearing is, even in the time of COVID, I mean, I think what we planned for, so many cities prepared for disaster response. Before COVID, we were really trying to be diligent, and now we've got to think differently. We've got to think about all of the other health implications and health and safety limitations we might have as well. So appreciate that perspective. Our next panelist is representing the utility perspective. We are very excited to have Joe Avila. He's a senior director with SoCalGas. Joe currently serves as the Senior Director of Energy Policy and Strategy, but he's held various leadership positions in both the private and the public sector. In his current role, Joe encourages and supports sensible energy policies and regulations to help California achieve its environmental and greenhouse gas mitigation goals. He's the perfect panelist for this discussion because, in addition to his more than 20 years of experience in the utility sector at LADWP and SoCalGas, he also has direct local government experience, including being a chief of staff for a council member in the city of Los Angeles. So, Joe, it's all you.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. I wanted to thank you and also Randy K. Stevens for inviting me to be on this panel today. I was especially excited to listen to, and even more so, Dr. Jones' presentation. I learned a lot today, and I may want to borrow some of those slides for future presentations. So I've got 10 minutes and 10 slides, so I want to dive right in. And if you could go to the next slide. Very good. So as you can see, SoCalGas is a very old company. We've been around, both ourselves and our sister company, SDG&E, has been around for over 100 years. We are the largest gas distribution company in the United States with 100,000 miles of pipe, which our new CEO likes to call the largest battery storage facility in the nation. We serve about 22 million customers. We have 6 million meters, both residential and business meters. We serve 500 communities around the state. And SDG&E, which is our sister utility, one of the three main investor-owned utilities here in California, has 3.4 million customers and serves retail customers from Orange County to the Mexican border. Next slide, please. So having spent my entire career in the utility and energy business, the focus for the most part has been on maintaining high reliability and affordability for every utility I've ever worked with or for. This notion of the obligation to serve is something that we hold very dear, and it actually stems from a NERC rule, which requires that utilities maintain a very high level of grid reliability and service. And it's a mantra that most every utility that I've ever worked for, and certainly every employee, is committed to achieving. But this notion of the obligation to serve has been changing a little bit, especially with the environmental objectives trying to be achieved. The obligation to serve is something that a lot of people are starting to question whether or not that's necessary, but I would guess that at this moment, families across the state, around the country, dealing with catastrophic events affecting whether it's floods or hurricanes or these devastating wildfires around the state, are starting to recognize that reliability is a mission critical need, and that resilient utility infrastructure has never been more important. Next slide. So I brought along a few of my colleagues from SDG&E as backup in case the water got a little deep here, but rest assured that no one is more acutely aware of the devastation of wildfires than we are. We've had several this year, including the Cherry and Lake fires, the latter of which I think is about 12% contained as of this morning. And in response to these catastrophic events, utilities, including SDG&E, have been substantially increasing their level of sophistication, both in terms of fire detection and prevention technologies. And really all utilities, which rely on different detection mechanisms like red flag warnings and other indices that Dr. Jones shared with you, they rely on historical empirical data that's collected from around the state, and these models consider a lot of different inputs, including temperature, wind velocity, direction, past wildfire activity, historical activity, and of course, there's a couple of technologies that I've seen personally that can actually monitor using satellite technology to proactively look at vegetation management efforts by utilities in and around energized infrastructure. That's transmission towers out in the field, as well as distribution lines within the city. If you look at SDG&E's most recent wildfire mitigation plan, it shared with regulators, the utility described how it was applying these highly sophisticated risk modeling techniques using historical fire information dating back to the 1970s. And these, along with a lot of other initiatives that we're putting into place at SDG&E, are hoping to improve the safety, reliability, and proactively maintain grid integrity and system reliability in order to make public safety shutoffs the measure of last resort to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, I've spent my entire career working with or for 3 out of 4 of the largest utilities in California, including SDG&E, SoCal Edison, and more recently, the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles. As such, I can't help but be a little bit biased in my admiration for the work that electric, water, and now gas utility workers do every day, especially during times of crisis. Along with first responders, electric, water, and gas utility crews work shoulder to shoulder to restore service to millions of families around the state. And a month after I started with SoCal Gas, and I've been home now for 5 months, the COVID pandemic hit our state, and all utilities went remote. Our field crews never missed a beat, and neither did any of the others in the state, and they seamlessly continued working while adopting and implementing new COVID safety protocols, including face coverings, social distancing, especially those having to make house calls. And while utilities have been battling wildfires for many years, and part of the reason why we were so well prepared, the frequency and intensity of these fires have really increased. And so I know our crews and the analytics staff, both at the gas company and SDG&E, have been constantly learning and adapting. And I know that we share a lot among the brother and sisterhood of utilities to support one another, especially during times of crisis. So it's not unusual, really, to see utilities from around the state and even coming from other states to help one another to restore power, water, and gas service. Next slide. This slide was given to me by one of my staff, and I really liked it because despite it's kind of a tranquil picture, and it helps illustrate a message that Mother Nature is constantly changing, and will adapt, and is really, as Dr. Jones pointed out, is really unpredictable. So as much as we like that we're in control and can rely on increasingly sophisticated predictive modeling tools, there's always these new scenarios which utility crews need to contend with. I mean, a great example is COVID. No one in our industry or in the world really had a playbook. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is that despite the immense challenges utility workers face, everybody, throughout the state, they worked together and they kept the lights on and the gas and water flowing around the state and around the country. So as a consequence, reliability, I think is one thing that I'm, as I said, most proud of. And it was one less thing for our governor and other elected officials and regulators had to worry about during this awful pandemic. But, in being out in the field, I can tell you that, make no mistake, the utility workers have been bent, but they didn't break. And I was really proud of the efforts of my brothers and sisters out in the field. Next slide, please. So Californians don't need to be reminded about the dangers of natural disasters. I mean, we just have to walk outside and you can smell smoke anywhere in Southern California today. And this slide really helps to illustrate the types of natural disasters affecting different parts of the country recently, from floods and hurricanes in the south to massive fires and earthquakes in the west. All these types of disasters pose different challenges every year to utility crews who scramble to restore power to families as quickly and safely as possible. But for many customers, when the electricity goes off, fortunately, the gas usually stays on. Next slide, please. And the reason for that is, just as a matter of course, gas infrastructure is installed underground and for the most part remains unaffected by floods, fires, and hurricanes. Underground transmission and distribution lines allow gas to continue to flow to homes and businesses during catastrophic events like we're seeing today. And many families in California who were affected by these fires last year had no electrical service for extended periods of time, but were still able to take hot showers, heat their homes, and cook food for their families. So I know that we've spoken to a lot of public safety officials and first responders, especially different staffs at hospitals, including Kaiser, which have gas-fired backup generators. And thankfully, even when they had challenges with regard to electrical power during these events, they were able to continue treating patients. They were able to energize fire suppression equipment in hospitals and other buildings. And I know that firefighters were able to use power to pump water to protect people and property. So I guess the bottom line is that having a dual energy system, especially underground resilient gas infrastructure, is, at least in our view, is a lot safer than putting all your eggs in above ground asset utilities. Next slide, please. So this slide is the one that I'm probably most excited about, and it illustrates the evolution and the speed of innovation that's happening in SoCal Gas. It's kind of funny to say those particular words in the same sentence when you're describing a utility, and as Erica mentioned, I've been in it a long time, and it's a fairly steady and unchanging industry. But I think this slide really shows you a glimpse into some of the new products and services we're championing at SoCal Gas that are designed to enhance reliability and resilience of our energy service capabilities. I think the most important issue is that these initiatives will help California not only meet its ambitious emissions reduction and environmental goals, but also it's just a really interesting time to be part of the utility industry, because at this particular time and day, because these are new technologies that will not only improve public safety, but also help our company and other utilities respond more effectively to natural and man-made disasters. SoCal Gas is aggressively pushing forward with different innovative technologies that lower carbon resources like renewable natural gas and hydrogen. I know that RNG right now is being injected into our system and could be an effective carbon negative fuel option in the future. But to be honest, hydrogen, which I'm just learning about here, is a true game changer. It's both a zero carbon fuel source, but it also can provide long-term, long-duration storage, and which is, if anybody's in the power business knows, is the holy grail of the power industry right now, as utilities are relying increasingly on quantities of intermittent solar and wind power. Next slide, please. So many of my former colleagues and friends asked why I left the Department of Water to join SoCalGas. And quite frankly, the answer was really simple. I didn't think that there was any other company that was more laser focused on supporting innovation in energy, especially fuel decarbonization, transportation, and in particular, in light of these disasters, resilient infrastructure development. And I know that SoCalGas leadership, especially our president, Miriam Brown, and our newly appointed CEO and former SDG&E president, Scott Drury, are enthusiastically leading our company into a lot more efficient and reliable and environmentally forward-thinking type company. I also know that we intend to accomplish all these ambitious operational and environmental goals without leaving our most vulnerable customers behind, which I think, in my view at least, there's no other company that's more focused or better capitalized to achieve and identify reliable, affordable, and increasingly decarbonized fuels energy solutions for our customers in the world than SoCalGas. Next slide. So thank you very much, and looking forward to answering some questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. All right,
Yeah,
our last panelist is, thank you. Our last panelist is Tom Ducker. Tom leads the California State Threat Assessment Center, or STAC's Critical Infrastructure Protection Unit. The STAC is part of Cal OES, and its goal is to share information and strategic analysis on threats and hazards affecting California. Tom's responsibility include oversight of critical infrastructure risk analysis, conducting site vulnerability assessments, and sharing information about infrastructure threats and hazards. Before joining OES in 2007, he served 23 years in U.S. Army intelligence. Tom, thank you for being here and closing out our presentations today.
Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you to the Institute for Local Government for allowing me to come and speak about a very important topic in here and looking at disaster response planning and how that co-intersects with COVID-19. Now, in the interest of getting to some of the questions I know you got out there, I'm going to go ahead and speed through the first couple of slides here. So, Brent K., if you could go to maybe the fifth slide where we talk about managing the risks, then we'll start with that. So rather than talk really extensively about me and my organization, just to understand that when we're talking about, let's go back, yeah, there, thank you, is that from the perspective that I'm at the state, is that we're looking at how to go ahead and identify these threats and hazards, and that trying to go ahead and look at what our vulnerabilities are and how to mitigate the consequences. And I just want to point out that we work in an environment where we're directly seated next to the individuals that are responsible with the California Cybersecurity Integration Center to look at those virtual aspects that are happening through the internet too, as we more and more become a connected society and we're dependent upon our connections that we make through that internet space, that virtual reality that we've created. So as we go through here and we're looking at these natural hazards or other threats that we may have, it's important to recognize that there's a dimension that goes beyond the physical, and they do intersect at times with things like industrial control systems and also through supervised control and data acquisition systems. So we should be looking at that holistic as we go through it. Randy K., can you bring the next slide up, please? So, when I started on this, coming out of 23 years in the Army, where I saw occasionally the statement about plans are worthless from Dave Eisenhower, our president and former Supreme Commander in Europe. And one of the things that what I didn't see emphasized is that what he emphasized in here is that planning is really important because it gives us the opportunity to roll up our sleeves, have all that information, that stuff that when we talk about Dr. Jones was talking about, that we have the scientific information, the best possible information. We're able to go ahead and work intelligently, roll up our sleeves and get things done. We have those relationships built up with the way Reva was talking about a little bit earlier. So we'll go on to the next slide. So as we get to the next slide, and just understand that COVID-19 is not what we commonly come those mudslides, those earthquakes, those fires, those floods that we come up again. We have no physical destruction, but we have a great deal of uncertainty in the course of the disease and how it's going to impact things. And it's something that is truly, truly around the world, and it's very uneven in its distribution. In the sense, it can impact us locally much harder internationally, or vice versa. But those impacts can go ahead and be felt both beyond us from having the significant local impacts, and those international impacts can go ahead and affect us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go ahead and be bold and just say that when we talk about our major infrastructure we have, whether it's communications, transportation links, power, water, we're going to overall have those remaining operations, specifically when we're talking about COVID-19 and its direct impacts, largely through a lot of great efforts through everyone within the emergency management community, within those that are running those infrastructures, and those that are dealing with the impacts of the public. And really, as a planner that we have here at our State Operations Center, it's continuing continuity of operations. It's continuing to look at what that COVID-19 does when we have it intersect with other things like an earthquake, flood, fire, things that come up during that course, and how COVID-19 hits it. And we should be continuing to operate looking at how we will operate in the future. So very forward-leaning. If you go to the next slide, please. So, there are always going to be issues we're going to face. There's going to be workforce safety issues, and some of these are going to be how we go ahead and deal with both a COVID-19 positive work staff, as well as those things that we will see from the public, and how the public perceives their need for services and goods based on the way the disease is acting at that particular time in the environment. We're going to have supply chain issues, and some of these may be, as we go longer into COVID-19, shakeouts in suppliers and changes in the way we do that, and we have to be open to the way in which we can go ahead and both work with new suppliers and also be able to go ahead and deal with those times as we begin to reopen or close where we may have bottlenecks of changing in our supply chain. So this all leads to uncertainty in our operating parameters. Go to the next slide. And I'll give you a couple of examples of some things that we could potentially look at in here. And one of them coming back to power, and ultimately that power that underpins all of us here. We can see it in here, particularly as we're going through these, right now, the impacts of high heat that be subject to public safety power shutoffs. And so as the fire season continues, is taking a look at how that affects us. And one of the things to look at is that we have a distributed workforce here that are at home, at work, potentially other locations that have been procured to go and do that. How are we going to deal with having certain parts of the state under PSPSs, and we have certain teleworkers in it? So this may even lead to kind of a reverse telework where we have the opportunity to go ahead and bring people in from areas that are affected by those PSPSs to those areas that are not. So it's an opportunity to look at all of those plans and across those relationships and go back to the utilities that underpin that and say, here are where our vital functions are. Here are those people that we need to have it. Maybe we're going to go ahead and shift during these to bring people, say, into a location where we may not have had it up recently and look at how we go ahead and keep those powered. So it's a way to go ahead and look at the plans that we may have and those things that we've already done in the light that we may have those different areas in the state that are going to be out of power. Next slide, please. And we're coming up into the winter season. It may not seem that way, but really we're only about 90 days out for that. An opportunity to look at how illness during that winter season is going to intersect with COVID-19 and potentially how that can change our operation. And one of the things to truly look at is if we have a bad influenza season here and how that intersects with the workforce that we have that'll be still working with COVID-19, and also as the public begins to go ahead and feel those impacts too. And this may lead to differences in the way that we operate. And in the wintertime, we may have a different operating tempo that we have to go ahead and look at. This could lead to things where different equipment is being used, or we need to also evaluate whatever protective equipment that we're using right now for COVID-19 and really take a look and see how that impacts it. If we're doing a lot of work outside and we're using cloth masks, how does that go ahead and work? Are there other opportunities or other things that we could do that could give us the equivalent protection? And so that's evaluating that now before we get to those winter conditions themselves, and understand that one of the things that could cause an additional disruption as we go ahead and look towards how we're dealing with disasters in this is we do have transportation slow down sometimes during the winter, or we're dealing with things with impacts along I-5 or I-80 that could go ahead and cause additional time and distance to get response equipment or mutual aid. And with that, if we get to the next slide, please. So at the state level, we have a state operations center that works as a hub at the state for mutual aid. And both coming up from local organizations and dealing with requests for mutual aid and dealing with response and recovery, there are a number of things to try and really look at as we go through and kind of look at our plans, COVID-19, and how we be responding to other disasters they intersect. Is one, the time and distance factor. Things are going to be happening locally, and we have, as our mutual aid system, the local agencies and organizations helping each other, then to region, and then up to the state to kind of look at how we do that across the state. So when we're getting that mutual aid from the state level, generally it's more lead time and more distance. So it's looking at how we have those recognized triggers for assistance, and when we're almost triaging these and looking at what can be provided locally, regionally, what should go up to the state, and when we do that, and recognize that as soon as possible. And on the state side, understanding those needs and being able to go ahead and evaluate what's going on statewide. Well, at the local time, evaluating those time, distance triggers and making the ask in a reasonable amount of time and in align with what they're going to be receiving to take care of things with local and regional mutual aid. And it's all about communication at that point to be able to go ahead and make sure that there's a balance with everyone knowing what are the future potential needs and what are those needs that really need to be tackled immediately, and understand when those are going to be arriving to go ahead and help out. So mutual aid and the State Operations Center is that important hub. If we could please go to the next slide. So just as we go into the emergency plan, and we have a lot of information that we already have collected on disasters, and as Dr. Jones said, there's a lot of scientific evidence out there. Let's take a look and review them in the context of COVID-19. And one of the things is that we talk about those big threes: fire, flood, and earthquake. But there's a lot of other areas that we might want to go ahead and look at. And localities, cities and counties and everything have local hazard mitigation plans that identify potential threats and hazards within this area. And it's a good place to take a look at to see what those additional areas might be that we need to go ahead and look at. And to review the plans in light of COVID-19 and where those additional changes to the triggers might be, and where things might prolong both impacts and also prolong the time frame to getting those responses there. So as we go through and we do this planning, it's so that planning then becomes that intelligent basis for us to go and roll up our sleeves and be able to get things done. When we have things that have those parameters, those things that happen that are outside of what we may have directly planned for, but that we can foresee and get everything rolling in a timely and effective fashion. Next slide, please. So here's just a couple of things, is that there's a starter kit from FEMA that was put out that is designed to bring out all of these particular areas and have a group go through them and talk through them. If you want to find more information on Callaway and planning and looking ahead and preparedness, has some things there and some general COVID-19 guidance. And next slide. If you have any questions for me or my unit, that's the phone number or the email that we can go ahead and be reached at. And thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so very much. I'm going to invite all of our panelists to come back on the line, and I want to acknowledge that we are at time for this webinar, but many of our panelists have agreed to stay on a little longer to make sure we get to some of your questions. There was just so much information that I think we all wanted to share, and we didn't want to cut any of that off, and we definitely want to make sure we get to a couple questions, so we're going to take those now. A few things as it relates to, many of you talked about, dust off the plans if they were already created, look at them with the lens of COVID, look at them with the context of health and safety. And then Dr. Jones, you mentioned that, one of the things that your agency does is that you really help think about things that are not only scientific based, but also cost effective. Can you talk about what some of the cost-effective things that you've seen being utilized across the world as it relates to preparedness or mitigation and natural disasters? What are some things that local agencies can really think about? Let's make sure your mic is on. I don't hear you yet.
Oh. How about now? Okay.
Now you're good.
About that. That's a rather wide-ranging topic. There's a lot of ways in which one can do this. I think the most important one is to get out of the silos, and so don't just get, there's a lot of things that help you get ready for an earthquake that are maybe helping you with other things. You can't do that multi-hazards approach to the extent that you lose, there's some things that only work for one thing and are potentially really important, and you can't forget that. But I think that trying to take a holistic approach, and also then trying to work with others, because I think the most common problem that I see is people going out to try and solve their problem and not noticing what's going on with others. Actually, I think as I look at Joe and remember, we had a really interesting event to look at the issues around Cajon Pass, where the San Andreas cuts off goes across every lifeline coming into Southern California within a few hundred meters of each other, so that when a gas line breaks and there's a power line nearby and there's a railway going by, and you can't get any of them unless you can get into, how do you fix it? You need the freeways to be working. And just the process of sitting down with the gas company, the electric company, the pipeline companies, Caltrans, and some water companies was a really fascinating process. So that, and I'm not sure what the answers will be when you do that, but when you do it, you're going to find something that's going to be able to help you. So I'd say the more you can work together, the more important it is.
I think it's a really good point when we think about, things that are technically free or very low cost, having a conversation, collaboration with key stakeholders, thinking about other agencies, whether they're potential mutual aid supporters or just ones that have shared boundaries or shared assets and resources. That's really important to do. I know, Riva, in your experience, that was an important thing for you. And I wanted to make sure your sound was good, but if it is working, talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you have done in Malibu as it relates to not only coordination, but we also have a question about what are some of the specific recommendations you might have around sheltering, right, because of COVID. Have you thought at all about that overlay of COVID with the preparation for this next imminent potential disaster?
Yes, absolutely. And we actually conducted a training last week of our EOC, a virtual training on Zoom, and we had our partners from Red Cross attend. And, some of the things that they're doing in other areas where there have been evacuations are actually having people shelter in hotels and renting hotel rooms. That's obviously very cost prohibitive if you're doing large scale evacuations. I heard recently the active fires that we had that they were having people shelter in their vehicles in a safe parking area where they would normally, send people into buildings, or having you do that in your vehicle. And then looking at multiple shelters, so where we might have sent everybody to, say, a gym in a high school nearby, we would look at sending them to 5 different locations. It's obviously much more difficult to staff that type of shelter up where you have that many, but these are the things that we're talking about.
Excellent, thank you. And this is a question, I think, for all of the panelists. I think, but one of the, in particular, since we're talking about infrastructure and the hardening of infrastructure, maybe Joe, you can lead us off and tell us a little bit about what kinds of things utilities are doing to really harden their infrastructure, both in the time of COVID, but even before. How can you, in the context of both gas and electric, if you can, what are utilities doing to kind of help us from that standpoint?
Okay, well, very quickly on the gas side, I know that we've been looking at ways in which to or I should say on the electric side, looking at power lines that within, I think it's 1.37 seconds of it disconnecting, essentially the time it takes for it to disconnect and hit the ground, they de-energize the power line. So from a technical standpoint, obviously that's very helpful because vegetation management alone won't solve the problem. There are, in high winds or, just Mother Nature just doing what it does, power lines go down. I think the biggest challenge for electric utilities, quite frankly, is balloons. I don't think that in the last 5 years, SDG&E has had any incidents at all related to vegetation or things of that nature. It's really balloons are a big one. Raptors, animals, squirrels and things like that getting up into the power lines, climbing inside it. Yeah, so that's an unfortunate thing. But on the water side, actually, you mentioned, Dr. Jones, about what's going on in Japan. I know that at the Department of Water and Power, they were installing pipes that were developed by a company called Kubota that actually flexed. They didn't put them everywhere, but they would put them in high seismic areas in order for them to, obviously to continue to provide water service even in high seismic areas. And they had this mechanism that would actually flex in up to, I think it's up to 9 seismic areas that are, pretty dangerous, obviously, but you could continue to provide water service.
Actually, Joe, it's one of the things I think that's been really great coming out of the city of Los Angeles is they made a commitment to using seismic resilient pipes. And because of it, at first those Japanese pipes were the only option, and they're relatively expensive. There are now 8 different American companies that have been certified, that their pipes have been tested and certified as much more resilient in earthquakes. So there's a lot of new opportunities to reduce that vulnerability.
Yeah, and obviously on the gas side, the fact that all of our equipment is underground, it just lends itself to being resilient. We'll have fires, we'll have floods, we'll have, the one thing that I think Dr. Jones pointed out to is it's unpredictable, and all the planning in the world won't necessarily prepare you for an extreme situation. You can have a tsunami twice as big as ever predicted. Things of that nature are going to happen. But again, going back to the point that I raised earlier, what I love is that the utility industry, just by design, works together collaboratively. If you're ever in a room full of engineers trying to solve a problem, it's quite humbling, quite frankly, and quite also inspiring just to see how the degree to which they work together to solve a problem, to save people and provide electricity for families and people they'll never meet.
Great. Thank you. Question for Tom, and this is related to something that you touched on in your presentation, but as you kind of are at the state level and you're seeing a lot of the emergency responders and the emergency managers, and you're kind of coordinating with lots of jurisdictions, what are some of the considerations that you're seeing first responders and others assisting people? How have you seen their response change because of COVID, and maybe your interaction with them change because of COVID?
So what you're seeing is that it becomes a lot more spread out in some ways, the response, in order to be able to go ahead and keep people still available and where they're not going to be infected by it. So you're seeing things like here, specifically wildfire, is where camps are more spread out, that you're using resources, your attack resources, as much as possible to go ahead and take that. You're looking at opportunities to go ahead and keep those crews isolated when they're coming off of the line. You're making sure that the support functions of those are in many ways that they're compartmentalized so that you don't have a crossfed of the disease. You have all these things come out. And of course, what happens then is that you have to have more of just about everything, and you have more of that time and distance when you're doing it. So there's more that element of wear and tear on the system coming from all these coming together and from spread out. So it's trying to go ahead and understand that, whatever you're asking for, you're doing, it's going to take more and it's going to take longer than you expect. And to try and raise those levels of expectation and make everybody aware of that, and to be able to at least anticipate. And, as I said, you can't anticipate everything, but having that information ahead of time and trying to scale up and understand and imagine based on the scientific evidence that you have and the information you have on the operating parameters is something that you can do, and it's very helpful.
Excellent. Thank you. Rita, there was a specific question. We'll just ask it now. If you can name the company, or if you, and we might have you email this person after the fact, asking about the name of the company that did the fire mapping for you. You showed that slide, and it was incredibly useful to some of our the people on the line. If you can share that with us, we would love it.
Sure. The name of the company is Flame Mapper, and I'm more than happy to share that information with you, Erica, and you can push that out to the group. Thank you.
We absolutely will. Thank you. And then one more technical earthquake question we'll have for Dr. Jones before we close this out. There's a question about the 5.1 earthquake today in Manadero and Baja California related to the Salton Sea earthquake swarms. Were they related on the San Andreas Fault? So is the earthquake today related to the Salton Sea earthquake swarms on the San Andreas Fault? Any idea there?
Only in the sense that all earthquakes in California are connected because they're all part of the same system, accomplishing the same movement of the plates, and the Earth doesn't care about political boundaries. But when we look at whether, related, are you asking, did one earthquake make the other one more likely? we only see triggering from one earthquake to another. We see it, we can do statistical tests and say, if it's more than about 4 times the length of the fault that moved away, then we don't see a change in the rate of earthquakes. It keeps the randomness. A bigger earthquake's on a longer fault. So Ridgecrest was 50 miles long. The 4.6 is only about 200 yards long. So we wouldn't expect to see any impact from the Salton Sea earthquakes. I mean, the San Andreas barely fit within that. And so there was concern because the San Andreas is, can give us an 8. Not many faults are long enough to give us an 8. You might need to know that the longer the fault, the bigger the earthquake. That's what controls the magnitude, is the length of the fault. So to have a really big one, you need a big fault, but also that affects how far away it can affect. If it had, if that 4.6 had been a magnitude 7, then it would probably have been like 50 miles long, and then this fault of 200, 300 miles away, you go maybe. But when it's only a 4.6, it just really can't have an impact.
That's helpful. Thank you. We do have one more question actually related to something Joe might be able to answer for us. Do you know, Joe, or one of your colleagues, if the electric utilities are sheathing the power lines with a target schedule?
Or what?
Sheathing the power lines with a target schedule.
Sheathing the power lines. I'm not familiar with that term. If they meant if they're trying to make them more fire retardant, there are condensers that they're looking at. I know that they're a lot more expensive. Obviously, there's always that cost benefit analysis that they're. I know that every utility I've ever worked for has been looking for a long time at either undergrounding, so that they could join us underground nice and safe. But that's considerably more expensive. There are condensers and things of that nature that they're investigating. And like I said, the one that they have at SDG&E, where that just de-energizes the minute it's disconnected from the system, that before it hits the ground, it actually de-energizes. So to the extent there's any type of vegetation or things of that nature in the vicinity, it's not likely to catch fire that way. So there's a lot of technology. They're constantly looking at new technologies, certainly the electric system, but it's always a matter of cost benefits. We could 100% harden the system, and it could cost trillions of dollars. So they're always looking for the optimum way to build the infrastructure to be as structurally sound and maintain grid integrity, but at the same time take into consideration affordability for our customers.
Excellent. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think what we see in our questions box was that people are trying to figure out how do they consider COVID and also response, and also think about, if we're in the context of energy infrastructure, in addition to the health and safety, what can we do without power, right? So there was even a comment about, how do we print posters if we can't use a traditional printer, right? What are some options there? So people are thinking very creatively, and I know that we're out of time, but what I want to make sure that we do is we give you guys a chance to say, is there anything that you think that this audience really needs to know before we wrap up? Anything that you kind of want to leave the group with?
I'll go first.
Go ahead. Go first.
I was just going to say, we've been saying forever, make sure you have 2 weeks of supplies, make sure you have a family plan, make sure you have a personal plan, and that goes for pretty much any disaster, whether it's COVID or an earthquake or a fire where there's no power, or a rotating power outages. So that would be my takeaway. Thanks.
Yeah, I would jump in and say that if there's anything that I've learned in my entire career, it's diversity is so important. Having a diversity of resources, whether it's a diversity from a fuel perspective or in terms of the energy sources, having a gas backup for generators, for example. I know that a lot of hospitals, in particular, will not operate unless it has a gas-fired type of backup system. And I know that firefighters have been pushing really hard to have fuel cells or microgrids that are gas-fired. To the extent that we lose a system because it's been de-energized either intentionally or otherwise, it's really good to have that diversity of fuel to ensure public safety.
Great, thank you.
I'll leave you with my favorite quote. I think it's actually from General Eisenhower, or eventually President Eisenhower, that plans are useless, but planning is essential. So congratulations on having this webinar, and keep it going.
Thank you so much.
And I just add thing on it, and that is communications. As we come in here and we're throwing all these curveballs, these different things come up, and we need to go ahead and assemble and move on to get this thing done. it's keeping communication flowing across everyone and trying to anticipate and knock these things down as fast as possible and anticipate as much as we can.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Randy K, can you go to the next slide, please? This is just a couple slides on how to stay connected with ILG through Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website newsletter. Next slide. The recording for this webinar will be available soon. We'll make sure that we push out not only the link to this webinar, but also any additional information from our panelists. And if there were any straggling questions, we'll try and add those into this response as well. Next slide. And then I want to thank again SoCalGas for your webinar sponsor and underwriting support for this. We do really appreciate you offering that so that we have the ability to offer this session free of charge. Next slide. And that concludes our webinar. This is the contact information for all four of our panelists. I want to thank Lucy, Riva, Tom, and Joe for your time today, for providing so much valuable information. Their email addresses are here if there were any additional questions you have for them, insights you'd like. Again, we know that COVID has been completely unprecedented, and we're so busy navigating that response and recovery for communities that it's hard to think about multiple issues and multiple disasters and multiple risks. But it's great to know that there are tools available, leaders that understand all of this, and we just really want to thank you, not only the panelists, but those of you on the line, registrants, for taking the time to be with us today. It has been an honor to have you join us, and on behalf of the ILG team, thank you and have a fantastic rest of your day. And before—
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.